The difference between tree risk assessment and tree risk management. If you're using the terms tree risk assessment and tree risk management interchangeably, you're making a professional mistake. And in some cases, that mistake has legal consequences. Today, we are going to separate these two concepts clearly and precisely using the language from ANSI A300 Part 9 and the ISA TRAQ Risk Assessment Qualification Framework. Because assessment is not management. And if you are TRAQ qualified or preparing to be, you need to understand exactly why. Let's start with the foundation. According to ANSI A300 Part 9, tree risk is defined as the combination of the likelihood of an event and the severity of the associated consequences. That's it. Risk is not the defect. Risk is not the tree. Risk is not the hazard alone. Risk is the combination of likelihood and consequence. In the ISA TRAQ methodology, that likelihood is broken into three components: likelihood of failure, likelihood of impact, and consequences of failure. These three elements are evaluated and combined using a risk rating matrix to determine an overall risk rating. Now let's define tree risk assessment. ANSI A300 Part 9 defines tree risk assessment as a systematic process used to identify, analyze, and evaluate tree risk. Notice the language: identify, analyze, and evaluate. Tree risk assessment is a professional evaluation process conducted by a qualified arborist to determine the level of risk associated with a tree or tree part. It involves inspecting the tree, identifying defects, assessing site conditions, evaluating targets, estimating likelihood of failure, estimating likelihood of impact, estimating consequences, and assigning a risk rating. Assessment ends with a rating: low, moderate, high, or extreme. That is where assessment stops. Now, here is where many professionals blur the line. Tree risk management is not the same thing, and ANSI A300 Part 9 defines tree risk management as the process of selecting and implementing mitigation measures to reduce identified risk. Let's break that down. Assessment determines what the risk is. Management determines what to do about it. Assessment is diagnostic. Management is decision-making. Assessment is analytical. Management is strategic. During management, we consider mitigation options such as pruning, cabling, bracing, target relocation, site modification, or removal. Management includes evaluating feasibility, cost, client objectives, risk tolerance, tree value, and long-term outcomes. Here's the key distinction. An arborist performs a tree risk assessment, but risk management is ultimately a decision made by the tree owner or manager. You provide recommendations, they decide which option to implement. That separation is critical for liability clarity. Let's walk through a real-world example. You inspect a mature oak overhanging a playground. You identify a large codominant stem with included bark and signs of progressive cracking. You determine the likelihood of failure is possible to probable. The playground is a high-use target. Consequences of failure could involve severe injury. You assign a high risk rating. That is tree risk assessment. Now comes management. The mitigation options may include structural pruning to reduce load, installing supplemental support, restricting access beneath the canopy, or removing the tree. Each option reduces risk to varying degrees. The arborist explains the options and expected risk reduction. The client decides whether to prune, support, remove, or accept the risk. That is tree risk management. Assessment answers the question, what is the level of risk? Management answers the question, what are we going to do about it? Another misconception is that mitigation is part of assessment. It is not. Recommending mitigation options may be included in an assessment report, but the act of implementing those options is management. And management is influenced by factors beyond the risk rating: budget, community sentiment, ecological value, legal exposure, and operational constraints. And ANSI A300 Part 9 is clear that risk cannot be eliminated entirely. It can only be reduced. So tree risk management is about risk reduction, not risk elimination. Now let's talk about liability. If you conflate assessment with management, you blur responsibility. When you perform a tree risk assessment, you are responsible for conducting a reasonable, systematic evaluation consistent with industry standards. When you recommend mitigation, you must clearly communicate expected outcomes and residual risk, but the acceptance of risk or the decision not to implement mitigation belongs to the tree owner or managing entity. That documentation matters. A TRAQ qualified arborist should clearly distinguish in writing the assessed risk rating, the recommended mitigation options, the expected reduction in risk, and the fact that final decisions rest with the client. This protects both parties. It also reinforces professionalism. Now let's make this even clearer. Tree risk assessment is the professional evaluation of likelihood and consequence using a standardized methodology. Tree risk management is the strategic selection and implementation of measures intended to reduce identified risk to an acceptable level. One is analysis, the other is action. One is professional judgment, the other is risk tolerance and decision authority. If you remember nothing else, remember this. Assessment quantifies risk, management modifies risk. They are connected, but they are not the same. And as arboriculture continues to professionalize, precision in language matters. If you're preparing for the ISA Tree Risk Assessment Qualification exam, this distinction is foundational. If you're already TRAQ qualified, your reports should reflect it clearly. Assessment is not management, and understanding that difference elevates your credibility, protects your liability, and strengthens your professionalism. If you found this valuable, subscribe for more advanced arboriculture education grounded in standards, biomechanics, and risk science. Because in this industry, clarity is competence, and competence builds trust. Thanks for listening to the Arborist-podcast. Let's keep building your arborist knowledge one domain at a time. If you found this useful, please like and subscribe.